Hello, everyone. Welcome back to our class in ethics and science. This is lecture 23, and it is the last of what we could call the normal lectures for this class. Next week, I'm going to produce two videos for you. One is going to be something just trying to tie up the loose ends of the class, pull everything together, and the other one is going to be a video on how to do well in the final, much like we did for the midterm, just to help you prepare, show you what's going to be there, all that, because I want you to succeed in this class. This is also the last week that we have for discussion posts. So our discussion post at the end of this video is going to be dealing more with course themes overall rather than the topic of conversation today. And let's get into what our topic of conversation for the day is. Let me share my screen, pull up our PowerPoint, and we'll get into it. It came to my attention after I made the PowerPoint that I've already made this joke about the Tree Finder book being our textbook for the class. So sorry, didn't have an extra one, but I want to get this recorded because tomorrow is Easter for me. I'm in the past, you're in the future for me. And what are we talking about today? Well, for lecture 23, we are still talking about science for policy, but we're talking about perspectives on science and policy from the majority world. And I'm going to give you three examples here. Pictured here on the right side of the screen is a woman named Wangari Maathai. She passed away a couple years ago, and she was really cool. If you're into tree planting, she's the person to talk about when it comes to tree planting. And the reason I want to include these perspectives from the majority world is because most of what is in our textbook and what has come to us through other readings has been American and European in character, and I want to include the perspectives of other cultures. Now, let's remember for a minute that I am not the best person to deliver the perspectives of these particular cultures. So please do the reading for this week, read what these scholars have to say for themselves, and understand that I am an imperfect presenter of their ideas because I come from a particular context, which is not their context, and I maybe might not fully understand it experientially because I can't, because I have not lived the lives they have. So, our three examples are going to be Vandana Shiva and the Green Revolution, Wangari Maathai and tree planting, and Kyle White, who talks about what he would say the myth of the ecological crisis, and we'll get into why he believes that it might be a myth. So let's start with Vandana Shiva, and I won't lie to you, she is a controversial figure, and it's mostly because of her criticisms of GMOs. Some of them, we can say flatly, are not scientifically accurate. Others might hold water. She has some interesting thoughts that we might want to think about. And in the readings I gave you from her, those are the ones where the things that she presents are worth conversation. In one of the optional readings, the one from the New Yorker, the author gets into some comments that she's made about, do the pesticides used on this or that genetically modified organism cause autism? And the answer we can say to that is, well, no. But she does have some very valid criticisms that we'll get into. And she is highly critical of scientific society, particularly this relationship between science, development, and colonization. So, Shiva's criticism of GMOs, like we said, some arguments don't hold up. There's this claim about fertilizers causing autism that, yeah, that's just the science isn't there. But the argument about the politics of agricultural science is a lot more interesting. She has an argument that the monocultures of farming GMOs is harmful to biodiversity. And that makes a little bit of sense, a lot of sense, actually. The idea behind it, behind many of these monoculture. What is a monoculture? It's when you only farm one crop. And the idea that she's putting forward is, look, if you're only going to farm, Monsanto brand rice, that's going to deplete the soil. You're not going to have the crop rotation you need. And when some disease comes by that wipes out that particular crop, your farm is dead. And so her thing is that you should plant diverse local crops because should you have enough biodiversity on your farm, one disease comes out, wipes out one plant, but you still have five, provided were planting six. And there's the 6 seeds. You read about that. And we can say that more biodiversity becomes more resilience to climate change because should there be a big change to your climate, you have more chances for something to adapt. Whereas if you are only growing one kind of food, that food, then you have one chance to adapt. Her other thing is food sovereignty. Yeah, planting things that come from a Western corporation, in her context in India, means that you are now reliant on that Western corporation for your well-being, for your livelihood, for your ability to eat. And if a community is practicing food sovereignty, they're taking care of themselves. They're able to provide for their own meals. Therefore, they don't need to rely on these outside sources that are giving them development, but also really profiting from their labor. A community that is food sovereign is able to take care of themselves. Does this mean that she's anti science? No, she's got a background in science. She's very knowledgeable about it. What she's against is these Western corporations coming in and taking over these communities and transforming them into employee farmers instead of farmers that own and control their own destiny. She also raises some pretty good questions about the ownership of plant species. The idea that somebody could own the idea of corn is not something that would have made any sense for most of human history. And she names that how can you say that you own a seed? You know, it was created by millions of years of evolution. If you're religious, it was created by divinity for every person and other plant on the planet. How is it that this or that crop created in a lab is going to be better than that? That's a fair question to ask. Some other interesting points. You know, she brings up and she uses the example of the Green Revolution in Bangalore, where it was heralded that, these Western scientists were going to come in and they were going to fix all the food problems in the province of Bangalore. And, they were heralded as saviors by global and Western media. And then when it all collapsed, well, they blamed the collapse on the farmers who lived there. And so science gets all of the praise when it works and none of the blame when it doesn't. And that's part of this idea that we think of science as value free unless it does something that we like, in which case it's got lots of value. Shiva, we might say, rightly names that relationship doesn't really hold up to scrutiny. She also would say something along the lines of, the scientific knowledge model has regarded nature, especially soil, as inert material. But there's more life in a square foot of soil than in your house, usually. And there's many living organisms there. The problem is that Western science, particularly in this very Cartesian Baconian framework, which we could question and say, is that science, or is it just that the founders of Western science got something wrong? But it doesn't typically we in the West, when we are doing the activity of science, and we could question that too, don't typically regard nature as a living thing or a community of living things. And by the way, this is the complaint of many Western scholars too. You know, Founder of environmental ethics, Aldo Leopold, argued for similar things. He just called it the biotic community and the land ethic. So how outside our frameworks is Shiva? Not so much, really. And in terms of climate change, she says, look, we have what we need for sustainability and climate resistance. Diversity is the basis of adaptation. We talked about that a second ago. And communities that have control of themselves are better able to prepare for climate change. It's when these communities are beholden to outside powers who don't really care about them that they're not able to prepare. If you're shipping everything that you grow out of your community, then you don't have any place to make a stockpile for when things go bad. It's a fair criticism that she's raising. Should we probably be pretty careful with the things that she says about GMOs? Yeah, be very careful, because some of those arguments are a little too friendly to things we know are just plain wrong. The line between her claims that GMOs cause autism and vaccines cause autism, both of which are wrong, it's pretty thin. And so we want to be careful when approaching someone like Vandana Shiva, knowing that she offers many good criticisms and has a couple ideas we might not want to embrace. Moving on, Wangari Maathai. So, her education, she held a PhD in veterinary anatomy, but most of her work was in sustainability through tree planting. She won a Nobel Peace Prize for her contributions to sustainability and democracy, and passed away a few years ago. The world is lesser for having her gone, by the way. She's great. And so, what was her big idea? You don't need an advanced degree to practice forestry and to plant trees. And where did she get to this? And you read the piece in her book about it, so I don't need to reiterate it much. She observed that the self-sufficient communities that she knew as a child were healthier and happier than those growing food for others. Even their cattle were healthier and happier when they were growing things that were native to the area. And for her, it was rural Kenya. Then it was when these farms that produced goods for the global economy that came in. Well, the land was hurt. They cut down trees because they needed to grow more coffee or sugar or whatever, which caused soil erosion, which made the plants not grow as well, which hurt the animals, which hurt the families because they spent all their money on seed so that they could sell what they grew instead of growing things for themselves. And they ended up worse off for having embraced their place in the global economy instead of just caring for each other in community. So, what was Mathai's idea? Well, first you need to fix the soil. How do you do that? You plant trees. You fight deforestation and environmental degradation by just a simple act. You plant a tree with your hands. And what she wanted to do was train people locally and work to tailor the environmental action to the local cultural and environmental needs. There's a short little paragraph in there about, you know, the ways that different communities embraced the use of donkeys and how, they wanted to teach people to have the donkey carry water so that the women in the community wouldn't have to carry the water, and how some communities didn't like that. And it's an interesting little conversation. And what she learned from it was that you have to work with people where they are. You can't change everything in a culture. And that's sort of central to her idea and to what we just talked about with Shiva, right? That there's a sense of sovereignty for these communities and they have a control over their own destiny. So, what did she want to do? She wanted to train and empower women to take charge of local ecology. You know, and when she tried to bring in experts from the outside to teach people how to plant trees, they told her, you need to understand the way that the gravel works around it and how the tree functions. You need to have all the scientific knowledge. And I'm sorry, but you're gonna have to pay us to plant these trees because you need a high degree. You need an advanced degree to plant trees. And she said, that's ridiculous. You don't need a degree to plant trees. It's a tree. You dig a hole, you put the sapling in, you water it over time, and eventually it becomes a healthy growing tree. And that sort of calls into question this sense of expertise of Western science. Because the scientists that she was talking to, and she is, a PhD in science herself, she's very intelligent, but she understood that there's something democratic about ecology, about taking care of the land that you live on, that our high levels of education might cause us to not see something. For one, the importance of just planting a tree to keep things in balance. And we don't need high budget techno fixes. We need forests. And we can plant a forest without much technology. In the last video, we talked about the Civilian Conservation Corps here in America. Planted 3 billion trees in Wisconsin alone. Did they have advanced degrees? No, they didn't. They were, on average, poor Americans who needed a job during the Great Depression. How different is the Greenbelt movement? How foreign is this really? It doesn't need to be. Finally, some American indigenous perspectives. And by that I mean one perspective, which comes to us from a scholar named Kyle White. I've linked his paper. This is optional reading. I do think it's quite good. His work is very well written. And what he says in that paper is, look, this is not a climate crisis. This is a symptom, and it's a new pronunciation of a problem that indigenous peoples in America have been dealing with for centuries. Specifically about two centuries and some change. That it's not a climate crisis; it's a crisis of colonization. The problem of colonization, it comes with these potential issues of modern science that we've talked about in this class. Seeing nature as dead material, problems with who qualifies as human, the idea that somehow humankind, which is usually, the borders of who qualifies as humankind are usually too narrow there, that somehow those people get to master nature and control it for themselves, and it's the people who have put themselves in the place of master over nature that have caused this problem. And for someone like Kyle White, who is a Native American, he'd say, look, the apocalypse happened in 1492. It's just taking all these European folks till now to realize that they were the ones who broke the world. Does this need to come with any sense of personal guilt? Well, let's not get into that. That's not helpful here. But we could say that historically speaking, in the geological record, Kyle White has a point. The genocide of Native Americans is visible in the geological record. I will give you an article about that because it is a eye-opening read. So, what questions do these perspectives raise? First one would be, are technological fixes for dealing with the climate and ecological crisis, are they necessary? Or are we expecting a solution to come out of the problem? That's something that scholars like Shiva and White have been very forward about, saying, look, the way to get around this does all these solutions we're proposing, even from the UN, seem to be technological in nature, seem to continue the underlying philosophical problems. And if we don't address those, are we really going to fix the problem? Or are we just going to create new needs? Because something we've learned in one of our previous lectures is that new forms of technology come with new needs. We used the example of the cell phone, right? That you have your cell phone and look, I have one too. I use it all the time. It helps you stay connected with the world. But it also comes with the felt need of being available at all times. I remember a time when we didn't have those. If you called someone on the phone and you called their landline and they didn't pick up, okay, they didn't pick up, they'll call you later. These days, you want to reach somebody, you text them and something's wrong if they don't text back, right? And then another question would be, how do we square these indigenous knowledges with the truth claims of science? Knowing that in some way we're talking about two different kinds of truth. And could it be that science is a form of truth? I've been reading a little bit of Gadamer lately, and I don't feel the need to give you a lecture about it because I don't have, complete understanding of his philosophy yet. But one of his big ideas is we need to expand the definition of truth outside of just scientific truth, because there's more to life there and there's more ways to understand our ways of being in the world, and science is a piece. It is a way to understand truth, but there are others. And should we expand our definition of truth, we can maybe have a more pluralistic society. We can embrace each other and come to understand each other a little better without trying to force each other to accept this or that worldview. Another fair question would be, what separates development and colonization? And here we could turn to Mathai and Shiva and say that they noticed something in the way that these communities that were being developed through outside means, whether it's the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, or just Western corporations hiring farmers to work their own land to grow this or that product, that in some ways wealth is being extracted from these communities instead of these communities being given tools for to embrace their own sovereignty. And so what do we do about that? Is there a way that we can still offer development solutions? Because you talk to people in certain parts of the world that don't have running water or electricity, and yeah, they want that. And that's shouldn't be withholding it from them. But how do we offer development, give people the tools for that without making it backdoor colonization, which is how it has been? And then how do we work for sustainability in a pluralistic world, knowing that there are many worldviews? How do we come together to offer solutions to the climate crisis, to living sustainably, to air pollution or ocean plastic or any other thing that is a science policy issue? Knowing that the solutions we offer come out of a very specific worldview. And we look for tech fixes, but others might not. And so how do we work together there? And then, final question, maybe I'm repeating myself at this point, but how should solutions to global problems like climate change account for or interact with forms of knowledge that differ from those of, broadly speaking, Western modern science? I don't have answers to these questions. So, this week's discussion post, and what I'm hoping is that this is our final discussion to wrap things up a little bit. So, here's what I want you to ask and answer. And you guys have been doing great with these all semester, by the way. First, what ethical considerations must be made when creating solutions for global problems like climate change? And it doesn't just have to be climate change that you consider here. Any global scientific problem that requires information for science policy or policy for science, any combination of the two, how do we go about this in a global way? And we need to ask this because obviously there is not one world government. We have the United Nations, but they don't have enforcement power. My dog is having a bad dream. I'm just going to tap her here. And so, how do we convince various nations to get on board with something that is a collective problem that goes beyond the borders of nations? And we're sort of living out this problem right now in terms of COVID-19. And if you've been watching the news, we don't really have, and haven't for this whole year that this problem has persisted, we have not had one unified solution in the world. We've had many different solutions. Every country has their own. And some have fared better than others. If you lived in New Zealand for this, you're doing great. I've got a friend down there. They locked down pretty early on. They stamped it out in their country and they're doing fine. Here in America, life's been a little hard. So, what do we do? How do we get nations to talk to each other for this? Because global problems, do they require global solutions or local solutions? Then, what ethical frameworks are best for asking and answering these questions? And framework, what I mean is going back to our big three, and then if you want to include care ethics, do that too. But is this a problem of utility? Is this a problem of deontology? Is this a problem of virtue? The articles that I'm giving you for this week in the optional reading stuff, it's a huge list because I just found a lot of it cool and I wanted to share it with you. But there's 2 in there about virtue climate ethics. And I think there might be some interesting stuff there. I don't know if I agree with it, but I like where their head's at. I like this idea of applying virtue ethics to climate change. But it's easy to think, okay, this is a utility problem, but there are real human lives if we're choosing who has to suffer. And so maybe we want to think in terms of deontology. I don't know. I don't have answers. There's no one right way to talk about it. And finally, how much scientific innovation is needed to handle global problems like the climate? Again, it's easy when thinking from a scientific framework to say, yeah, we need a science solution. But, why do we need to create carbon scrub systems when we can plant trees? And you can teach anyone to plant a tree. You can't teach anyone to build a, carbon capture system. So that is our discussion post of the week, and that is the video. What I hope is that this has been an interesting conversation for you. Certainly figures like Shiva and Mathai and White are pretty popular in the philosophy department here at UNT. And so if you take any other classes in the department, especially dealing with environmental issues, you're likely to encounter them. Maybe you have already and you have thoughts from those other classes. Please include those in the discussion post if you do. And if you don't, I'd like to just welcome you into the discourse of environmental philosophy. So I will see you all later. I'm going to get our final written pretty soon. And yeah, thanks for watching.